I'm Addison Smith with Campus Reform. Today, we're going to be talking about critical race theory and everything you need to know. Joining us today to talk about just that is Dr. James Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is a mathematician, political commentator, and author of several books, including his most recent book, Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. Lindsay is also the founder of New Discourses, an online resource that aims to meet the need that the problem of political alienation and homelessness has created by giving you the tools that you need to understand what's going on around you in the world and talk about it effectively. Dr. Lindsay is widely regarded as a leading voice against critical race theory in the intellectual and academic realm. So, Dr. Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I want to dive right in. The topic, of course, is critical race theory. But before we address some of the other questions and components about it, I think it's important that we define our terms. And that seems to be a problem with critical race theory in and of itself. A lot of the times it seems like people are just talking at each other and they don't have a working definition. And when they get down to the definition, they disagree. No, it's about this. No, it's about that. So can you describe to our audience what exactly is critical race theory and how does it work?
Yeah, let me take one step back from that before I do that and explain why there is this problem of the definition, why nobody knows what they're talking about. And the truth is that critical race theory falls into a category of ways of thinking about the world that use language in a highly specialized way. And, everybody's kind of familiar with, maybe business jargon or education jargon or sales jargon or whatever it is, and, academic jargon. But this is actually a little bit deeper than that. This is not like, how scientists use words very specifically to mean very specific things and have very clear definitions. Rather, what this is that critical race theory uses its terms in ways that trade off of two definitions at once. And so when they use a word like critical, for example, or a word like even race, or a word like, say, racism, they actually mean two things at once when they use those words. And so it's very difficult. So if I give you a definition straight out of their book, then we can talk about that, but we have to understand the terms in two different ways as we proceed. And if I give a definition that I think boils it down, they can easily say, oh, well, no book says that, and that's not quite right. So that said, that's why it is that it's never quite clear what anybody seems to be talking about with critical race theory is that it very intentionally has been designed to use words in two ways at once and to trade in that equivocation between words. So it's a very important thing to understand getting into this. It'll help minimize the amount of semantic argument that comes up when people try to engage with it, because as you did, it leads us to let's really spend some time nailing down what we mean by words. And if you want to call a thing one thing, fine, but we have to agree to that, and it doesn't change, because if they can bounce back and forth between multiple definitions, stuff gets messy. So what I think critical race theory boils down to, and I can give you their definition if you want to, is the belief that the fundamental organizing principle of society is racism, which they describe as a system of racism. So our society has, for them, systems of power that operate, that shape how things come out. They call this either material or structural determinism as a set of beliefs that there's structures of society, like systems of power and these power dynamics that they talk about that create oppression, that confer dominance or privilege, and that these create material and other outcomes that are determined by the way that those systems of power operate. So they start from a belief that there are systems of power. Racism is such a system, and that it has material and other consequences that are real and affect people's real lives. And what I say is that what they actually believe, critical race theory, is the belief that racism is the fundamental organizing principle of society. And that's a pretty bold shift from the way that most of us think about racism. Most of us think about racism in terms of, oh, this guy is a jerk, or that woman said something inappropriate, or maybe it was just kind of like insensitive. They didn't mean anything by it, or we think about it in terms of, so that's individual racism, or they think about it in terms of law. Maybe somebody created Jim Crow laws 50 or 80 years ago or whatever, 80 years ago, I guess. And those were explicitly racist. Maybe later people came up with things like crime bills that vastly disproportionately affect one race over another. And maybe there were racial motivations for why they did so. That's called institutional racism. And what they have is this idea is that there's actually one step further back from that, an entire system in operation that makes sure that those things keep happening. Racism keeps happening at the individual level. Racism keeps manifesting. People keep reproducing those patterns. Institutions keep coming up with solutions to problems that create more and more and more institutional racism. And then the system itself is still acting to disenfranchise certain people and to advantage or privilege other people. And so that's what critical race, I think that's a pretty fair definition of critical race theory that's not theirs. Theirs is that it's a movement within scholarship and activism that challenges the prevailing notions of the relationships between race, racism, and power, especially in law. And therefore, it's the way that the law has been used historically and therefore still continues to reproduce these unfair outcomes or these disparate outcomes. And so for them, the main system of the origin point of critical race theory is the legal system, although they also say that it has now branched out into knowledge production. It's now branched out into science. It's branched out into basically education, like every other field of activity or cultural production and maintenance, all the way down to the way that we speak. You hear things like linguistic justice, like, does the way we pronounce words create disparate outcomes? I think I saw something yesterday that said that certain birds perpetuate racism somehow. And so, I mean, so it's literally gone from law into everything, literally down to birds, which maybe birds are racist. I don't know any birds that well to tell you, but
Give it a few years. It'll probably,
yeah,
some study will come out.
yeah, cardinals don't like blue jays or something. I have no idea.
Well, I think that's an important point that you mentioned on earlier. Is it seems to always go back to the language, and the critical race theorists, they do have a good way with words, and they are controlling the language, and whoever controls the language is ultimately going to control the culture. And one thing you mentioned about their definition of critical race theory is, and I heard you talking about this in another interview, was one of the first sentences in an introduction to critical race theory book is that critical race theory is a movement. And you pointed out in that interview that, well, theories are not movements.
That's right. That is the first sentence. I mean, there's a preface before that, and then there's a little story. But in the book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Richard Delgado, who is a very famous, long established, he's in his 80s now, he's very old, but he was a very active critical race theorist from very close to the beginning. He's a very well established, he's not a fringe character, that's what I'm trying to point out. Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik wrote a textbook for undergraduate levels, college students, called Critical Race Theory and Introduction. And the first sentence says that critical race theory is a movement, blah, blah, blah. And as I just laid out, and that paragraph concludes, by the way, just so people realize, the same first paragraph concludes with the sentence, unlike traditional approaches to civil rights, which favor incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory calls into question the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. So there's a lot to get thrown there, but let me just unpack that sentence half a second here, or maybe half a minute. Unlike traditional approaches to civil rights, okay, and what that favor incrementalism and step-by-step progress. Well, if they don't want to do that, what do they want? They want a revolution. Okay, so it's a revolutionary movement. So they've already confessed this in the first paragraph of this book. They didn't say the word revolution, but they reject incrementalism and step-by-step progress, and they call themselves a movement. So you can deduce. Then we get further, and what do they call into question the very foundations of the liberal order. A lot of people associate this with liberals because we think left of center means liberal, but these people are not liberals. They are leftists. It's a very different thing, and they are very radical leftists who want a leftist revolution. So we can deduce that, and they're rejecting the foundational principles of the United States. The liberal order is what they're referring to, and that includes for them equality theory. All men are created equal. Not for them. We got to get rid of that. We want to be able to actively discriminate. In the words of Ibram X. Kendi, the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's on page 19 of How to Be an Anti-Racist. So you can look it up yourself. He actually said that. They want to discriminate. Legal reasoning, that's your rule of law. We're going to get rid of that, apparently. Legal reasoning is remember, it's a movement within law that it arose from. So the idea is that law recreates racism. So they don't want legal reasoning. No equality, no legal reasoning. They call into question Enlightenment rationalism, the idea that we can step back and act as rational rather than purely emotive agents. They're that we can appeal to evidence as the arbiter of whether something is true or false, that we can look to objective standards. They want to get rid of all of that. And they're very explicit that they want to get rid of objectivity, to the point where they're arguing that 2 plus 2 doesn't have to equal 4. And the reason they give, why do they say 2 plus 2 can equal other values, is because we have to get away from the notion, they say, of objective truth. So they want to get away from objective truth. That's Enlightenment rationalism. And the neutral principles of constitutional law. Well, the whole point of the United States is that it's a nation founded on ideas, and those ideas are encoded in the highest law of the land, which is the Constitution. And that Constitution is said to be held, or to be applied neutrally to every single individual. Each individual is treated equally before the law in as blind a fashion as possible. Justice wears the blindfold, for example, carries a scale and a sword. So they reject this as well. So they reject the idea of a neutral interpretation of the Constitution. They may reject the idea of constitutional law entirely. So this is a complete repudiation, this movement, of the liberal order, or in other words, of the United States. And in fact, they confess in that sentence, that they're in that paragraph, that they are a movement meant to have revolutionary change to our system.
And going back to what you said about the radical questioning, it's starting to sound a little bit like questioning the liberal order, questioning rationalism itself. It's starting to sound a little bit like that line from Marx, the ruthless criticism, engaging in the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And I think that kind of leads us into our next question, because
let me jump on that real quick, because you know what Marx called that idea? He called it his critical philosophy. And the critical philosophy, a generation later in academic language, became critical theory. And critical theory eventually took on the issue of race and became critical race theory. So it doesn't just sound like that. There is a direct, it's like, Darwin's finches. It's like, oh, it's got like a little bit different shaped beak now. It's just evolved down a little bit. It's the exact same idea. Marx's critical philosophy became critical theory, became critical race theory.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why we're seeing it gain so much popularity so fast, because here at Campus Reform, we've reported extensively on critical race theory, anti-racism, taking over academia, especially in the last few years. Critical race theory, it's been around since the 1970s, and critical theory in and of itself even longer than that, and obviously Marxism even longer than that. But we're really seeing it start to pick up traction, especially over the last few years. And so I know you talk about how on your website you say, is critical race theory Marxist? You say yes and no. And I want to get you to expound on that a little bit and talk about the tie-in with college campuses, with why it's gained so much popularity. Is it because of its Marxist roots? What is it?
Well, there's a lot of things that go into why it's gained popularity, but the yes and no question is a little bit straightforward. We actually just talked about one dimension. Marx's critical philosophy, which is part of the heart of Marxism, has just come right on down the trail and became critical theory, became critical race theory, also critical gender theory, etc. And so just right on down the trail, critical social justice is a evolutionary outcome. In fact, it follows, if you want to get really nerdy about it, the dialectical process. And I have a whole long podcast about the influence of Hegel, who was one of Marx's inspirations. You can actually go listen to that. It's 4 hours, so I don't want to break it all down here. But there's actually a certain direction in which the way that this has evolved to make it go from Marx's critical philosophy of ruthless criticism of everything that exists, tear down the existing society, down to critical race theory and these other critical social justice ideologies. So that part is retained. The Marxian idea of conflict theory, that society is stratified by power dynamics. And so there are winners and losers. You find a power dynamic and there are people who win. Those people he called the bourgeoisie, and we call now the privileged. And there are people who lose, and he called those the proletariat, and we call them the oppressed, or the subaltern, which is a very much deeper level of supposed oppression. And so there's a power dynamic. It stratifies society. You can think of like rocks, like geology, the layers, and the one layer floating on top of the other. Society stratifies into layers of relative or relational, as they put it, privilege and oppression. And the relation is the relation to the power dynamic. And so across those lines of stratification, Marx said that there's intrinsically conflict, that the classes of society are in conflict, class conflict, he called it. And that class conflict is now just transferred over into another domain. You pick a system of power, if it's racism, if it's misogyny, if it's transphobia, if it's cis heteronormativity, whatever you want to have, you pick a domain of society, a power dynamic that they identify relevant to that domain of society. And there are the winners and the losers, and the winners are in conflict with the losers. The oppressed are in conflict with the oppressor. And the goal is that for Marx that the oppressor has to be overthrown by the oppressed. That has been retained as well. Furthermore, just to add one more kind of parallel, the Marxian view is actually that these power dynamics create a superstructure that dictates how society actually operates. But we just talked a moment ago about systemic racism being something that operates like a superstructure that dictates how society operates. It's materially and structurally determinant upon people based on their racial categories, based on how that line of power works. So this same ideology has been retained. Now, how is it not Marxism? Well, first of all, they refer to it as vulgar Marxism. They refer to the critical race theorists refer to Marxism as vulgar Marxism because all it focuses on is economic class. And it holds certain ideas that didn't turn out to work out very well, like a kind of crude historicism. Marx believed that the advanced capitalist societies are going to eventually realize their own contradictions. And what are they going to do? They're going to revolt. The workers will unite and revolt, and they'll create a socialist state that will eventually work out its internal contradictions and work out all the problems and become a communist utopia. And that this is a trajectory of history that's going to happen. And this is called vulgar Marxism, a vulgar Marxist thesis in the critical race literature. They believe it's a little more subtle and sophisticated than that, but they've retained most of the basic architecture. But they literally think that it's way too simplistic to think, oh, this is just going to happen by virtue of things. So we have to agitate more. We have to raise critical consciousness. We have to pull people out of false consciousness or internalized racism or the comfort of whiteness. We have to pull them out of this. We have to raise this consciousness in people or it's not going to work. They also reject Marx's pure economic analysis. Marx was too simplistic. There are many factors of cultural dynamics that lead into economics is just one of many variables that lead into how a society works. And Marx was too reductionist. These are the kinds of things they actually reject. So it's not Marxist in that sense. I mean, even the Marxists themselves, modern day Trotskyites, say things like they're against critical race theory, and they say the slogan is supposed to be workers of the world unite, not races of the world divide. And so they are not the actual Marxists, those that are still out there, are not real keen on critical race theory. And critical race theorists say that they're a bunch of vulgar fools who believe in being able to, they're privileged, in fact, fools who think you can ignore things like the imposition of racial power, the imposition of gender power, et cetera. So it's not strictly Marxist. And what it's aiming for is not strictly a communist utopia either. It's this liberated kind of, there's no real description of what liberation is. The closest you find in an essay on liberation by Herbert Marcuse is that it's socialism without the bureaucracy, whatever that's supposed to mean. So they're aiming for this I don't know what a state managed economy with no bureaucracy is supposed to look like. I mean, that's just fantasy camp is what that is. But that's the kind of stuff that they describe, and they separate themselves from the classical Marxists in that regard. So the answer is yes and no. They're definitely going to also seek redress for historical imbalances or injustices. So it's more like ethno-communism plus reparations is kind of the goal. And it's a slightly different model in that regard.
And why these ideas that you just laid out, why do you think that people are becoming so warmed up to the idea, particularly on college campuses? Professors are teaching it. It's St. John's University has a critical race theory minor now. So we're seeing it, spread through academia like wildfire. Why do you think that is?
There's a number of reasons for this. It's actually really complicated. And we have to talk about the professorate and teaching it. And we have to talk about the so-called long march through the institutions, as it was named by Rudi Dutschke in the 1960s, which is basically the Antonio Gramscian model of cultural Marxism, where he said that you have to infiltrate the various cultural institutions where culture is made, where culture comes from, and you have to change them from within. It turns out the same guy I keep mentioning, Herbert Marcuse, also reading these things in the 1960s. He starts writing in the essay on liberation. He has paragraphs and paragraphs about how You have to basically find the revolutionary energy in the so-called ghetto populations. That's his wording, just to use it exactly. I know we'll get in trouble for me saying that or something, but everybody knows what he's talking about. And that basically that those people need to fuse together. He mentions this also in One Dimensional Man, his 1964 book, with the leftist intelligentsia. And they started to realize that the radicalism, the violence in the 1960s wasn't working, and it wasn't going to work. So they changed tack and started to invade higher education. You had these kind of philosophy type professors like Marcuse who were inspiring and teaching generations of very radical students, and they were kind of funneling into universities. Eventually, by the early 1980s, they realized that the real site that they needed to take over, one of Gramsci's 5 main cultural institutions, is going to be colleges of education. So what you'll notice is that a lot of the people who are pushing academic departments are often not PhDs, but EDDs. They're people who got an educational doctorate and they got brought into a department and they were actually educated in schools of education rather than in some harder discipline. And these people, there's a paper from 2016, were trained, in their own words, as viruses to infect other disciplines. And what they did marching into the institutions was they slowly created, under Marcuse's model of repressive tolerance, a way to create pressure at the administrative level to push out conservatives, let them retire, find trouble with them, get that pressure them out, while encouraging hiring of and rewarding and giving promotions to special rewards for, say gender diversity or gender focus or women in science or whatever it happens to be, to bring in people who have the leftist ideology. So they started to fill the ranks of the professorate. So if they're teaching it, and if the culture that they maintain on campus is one way, it's all going to steer in that direction slowly over time. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is y'all young people tend to be idealistic. And so communism is a very idealistic ideology. It's one of those things that looks good on paper until you realize, like, oh no, people aren't actually that way. And when you're young, there's a lot, and I mean this, I don't mean any disparaging. There's a lot of like, oh, wow, the future is a whole wide open possibility. There's all these different things that could happen. We could just think differently. And the answer turns out to be, yes, you can, but only to a limit. You can't actually get away from certain things that are underlying human nature. And you can't operate a society where you're not taking into account certain trade-offs and certain facts, like that the market itself doesn't just move money and goods, it also moves information. It tells people what people want to buy, how much of that they want to buy, etc. So markets actually provide data and information. A good example of that with the COVID virus was that if every single state locked down identically, then we have no control group. So we don't know we can't actually know whether or not lockdowns worked. Same idea with the market. If everybody has to buy the same 3 hats, we don't actually know what kind of hats people want. I say that because that's what was for sale in the Soviet Union, were the same 3 hats. That's it. There's no information being exchanged about what people actually want. So, and how that performs when it gets out into the market. So there are certain unrealistic assumptions that feed into this, and the idealism of youth. And so that's a fertile breeding ground for this. Furthermore, the education, because these people took it over, has become what I would say is red washed. We hear all the time about whitewashed education. We're just telling this, white supremacist version of history. But actually, we're not teaching people about communism. We're not teaching people about the horrors of communism. I know lots of people who can name all kinds of things that happened, and people who are in their 20s right now who can name all kinds of things that happened racially throughout the United States and the ugly racial history of certain aspects of our history, but they've never heard of Trofim Lysenko. They don't know who that is. Do you know who Trofim Lysenko is? You're on the spot.
I'm afraid I don't. You'll have to educate me.
Trofim Lysenko was the Soviet biologist and agriculturalist who came up with the backwards Soviet biology and agriculture that led directly and indirectly to the deaths in Soviet Union and China of probably 100 million people. 100 million people died in the 20th century as a direct result of enforcing this guy's bad science, and hardly anybody's ever heard of him. That's the kind of thing where we're looking right now with COVID, with everything else, at the politicization of science. That was an example of the politicization of science. They had Soviet biology. They couldn't use Western bourgeois biology. They had Soviet agriculture. They didn't need Western bourgeois agriculture. And they politicized science, and 100 million people died. And nobody even knows this guy's name. This is what I'm talking about, right? So they talk about a whitewashed history. We've had a redwashed history. People in your age cohort are very fond of and warm to socialism because A, it's very idealistic and looks good on paper, and B, they have no idea how catastrophically it fails every single time it's tried. And C, the reasons why it fails, which have been delineated across the latter half of the 20th century quite eloquently. And so we have a red-washed education system. And finally, they've been very effective over the past 12 or so years, 15 years maybe, at mainlining these ideas into the culture along very emotionally resonant lines. And that's provided fertile ground. We had our first Black president elected in 2008. There was a bit of racist backlash to that actually occurred, and the media played that up to a fevered pitch. Black Lives Matter emerges under that presidency, played that up to a fevered pitch. Wow, racism is so much worse in our country than we ever suspected. Trump runs for president. What did they say? Racist, 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 racist. Turned that up to a fevered pitch. Trump wins. Only racists could possibly have voted for somebody so racist. Turned that up. So hidden racism underneath our society, causing all of the scariest problems you can imagine, has been a very effective, very consistent narrative for most of young people's lives. And so it makes it very attractive that the thing, critical race theory, that bills itself as the ability to find hidden racism is going to be something that they want to take up and want to believe and want to march for and want to get out and do something to try to make the world better, even though if they fully understood what they were backing up, they would be horrified.
And talking a little bit about what they are backing up and the havoc that critical race theory has wreaked on our education system and on our culture in America at large. We've talked about the problems, we've talked about the symptoms. I want to talk a little bit about and close with the solutions. And recently we've seen a lot of parents of K through 12 school boards, for example, it's been in the news, going to their school boards and saying, no, you're not teaching my kid this. We reject it. People seem to be coming out in droves against it now. It's starting to look like people, thankfully, are waking up to the dangers of CRT, and hopefully that trend continues. But that said, what do you think is the antidote to critical race theory? What do we do about it?
I mean, the antidotes are certain principles. I've named 4, which are kind of like 5 because one of them's a pair. And I think that that's a bit abstract, but I think that that's where it starts, is with principles. And I named truth, beauty, liberty, and responsibility. That's the paired one, and merit. So if we focus on those, we're not going to compromise the truth for narrative. If we focus on making things beautiful rather than ugly, where I define beauty as that being excellent in what it's trying to be. So excellence, it's a Greek ideal. We get back to those things. If we focus on the idea that liberty is important, the individual liberty to not have to subsume to a collective or a group, we don't have to think in group identities, is crucially important, but you can't have liberty without taking on responsibility. So responsibility is the virtue that is an antidote to that. And then merit, if you listen to, for example, Jordan Peterson, he's very good at saying that societies are going to form hierarchies. Communist type thinking and critical race type thinking are very, very good at lying to themselves, in saying that you can get away from hierarchies, that hierarchies are the problem. It's a very kind of left-wing fantasy. You cannot get away from hierarchies. And what Jordan Peterson argues, not only is that the case, but he goes further and says that making a hierarchy based on competence and merit is the least corrupt form that you can possibly have. It's not to say it's totally not corrupt. He's not making, we're not making an idiot argument here. Meritocracy is not perfect, but it is the least corrupt hierarchy you can form, is that, can you do the job? Can you get it done? That, it doesn't care what you look like. It doesn't care where you came from. Doesn't care who your parents were. Doesn't care who your grandparents were. Doesn't care anything. Can you do it? And if you set the standards and you don't compromise on the standards, and you say anybody you can get over it, over that bar is qualified, then you have a powerful antidote to this, but that's merit. So those values are very effective antidotes. More practically, it turns out, as much as the critical race theory types talk about things like accountability, they don't like it very much if you make them accountable. So if, for example, I know this is a campus reform thing, so this is more of a career oriented answer. But if you happen to be, somebody in your company, for example, or whatever, says, oh, I think we need to get a more diverse workforce. And you say, we're not compromising on our standards. Merit doesn't move. It's your job now to go get them. And if you can't, you're fired. They quit. They don't want to do it. It's amazing. It actually, that principle, they're not very good at being held accountable to their fantasies because they actually don't know how to do it. These things operate on what's called negative thinking. That's Herbert Marcuse's word, or actually it's a critical theory term for it. Herbert Marcuse uses it a lot. Negative thinking is that you just talk about the problematics, you just complain, and then the good thing will emerge from getting rid of all the bad things. And it's not real. You actually do have to do hard work of building things. You're going to have to deal with trade-offs. You're going to make mistakes. And so getting out there and actually trying to build something, I want to actually sit down at some point and just talk to people about, how much value comes to your life by doing work. You'll notice if you read a lot of their literature that they don't want to work. Your life is enriched by going out and doing work, by trying and failing, by trying and succeeding, by trying something else and failing or succeeding. And to just put the effort in is a very enriching thing for people. And so taking on the ethic for yourself of wanting to do that is an antidote. So there are a lot of antidotes, but as far as practically, people need to show up. People need to inform themselves. What is this really about? If I care about racial justice, is this working? And then when you look, I think I read a statistic the other day. I can't cite it, so it may be bogus. Let's put a bookmark on that. There's something like 95% of the companies that took up diversity training in the last year are having problems because they did, not having a better workplace. Well, maybe racial justice is something you care a lot about, and I would totally sympathize with that and agree with you to where there is actual racial injustice. But you have to also look and say, how we go about things matters. Is this working? And the answer is very clearly it's not. Everywhere it goes, it makes people hate each other, makes things fall apart. It's not actually working. You gave billions of dollars as a country to Black Lives Matter, and then we, all these people who are integral to Black Lives Matter, like Michael Brown's father, are coming out where's the money? And why do these people have big fancy houses? Oh wait, you built a wall around your house too. So something is amiss, and people should really start to ask those questions. What's really going on here? Is this the best way, or are there other ways? Because it doesn't look like what we've done over the last year and a half has worked. We have more Black Lives Matter. We have more Black people being shot in streets in our nation's cities than we have since the 1990s, when lead poisoning was making everybody crazy and violent. The violence spike, which has mostly ended up with dead Black people in cities, has been unbelievable in the past year. Black Lives Matter, where? It's not working. I get the sentiment, but your sentiment's not enough. You actually have to have workable solutions. Mm-hmm. So people need to start looking at the reality of what's coming out of the hype and asking themselves the hard questions. Is it working? And if not, are there better ways? And what did they look like, or what do they look like? What things have we done in the past that were actually successful? How did we pull off a civil rights movement and it actually worked? How did we diminish many of the problems of poverty and crime and so on since the 1960s? What actually worked and what actually didn't? And start looking for more effective ways, rather than just saying, oh, well, I said Black Lives Matter, so we're just going to go along with that. And even though it's causing a catastrophe everywhere it goes, asking those kind of questions, it's skepticism of the narrative is an antidote.
I think especially truth and responsibility, as you pointed out in your principles, is something that I think would fix a lot more problems in America today than just critical race theory. So with that, Dr. Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time. I know I learned a lot from sitting down with you, and I know our audience will too. So I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about critical race theory, be sure to check out this video right here by Angelo Morabito, CRT 101. You don't want to miss it.